Welcome to another episode of Farming in Ohio with Chris Bruynis. Today he's going to be looking at the fiscal year 2023 Farm Bill. So stay tuned. Welcome back to another episode of Farming in Ohio with Chris Bruynis. Chris Bruynis is an extension educator in Ross County. Chris works with a number of different farmers throughout the state of Ohio on various different platforms. And today he's going to be talking about the fiscal year 2023 Farm Bill. Chris, always a pleasure talking with you.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about Farm Bill today simply because, number one, it's probably misnamed because it should be the Food and Farm Bill. SNAP benefits is part of the Farm Bill legislation. But I'll get further into that. But, I really want to have people have an understanding of what this legislation is, because we have, 1.5% of the population of the United States engaged in production agriculture anymore. So, it's kind of hard to say, why are we protecting such a small farm population? Why aren't we doing more for the rest of the population? Well, this legislation, I think, does address broader than just our people out on the farm.
Well, I know that in the state of Ohio, agriculture is one of the major industries that we have, and a number of other states are really involved in agriculture. So this farm bill really deals not only with Ohio, but over the United States.
It does. It is national legislation. And, one of the things that I think to understand it, let's first talk about how did we get here. And so the Farm Bill, it is a multi-year law that governs United States food and agricultural programs. It's renewed every 5 years. Although, as we were talking earlier, Patrick, I was in Washington, D.C. lately, and we were talking about the Farm Bill with our legislators there, and they were not very optimistic that we're going to get this legislation done in time for 2023. And so what will happen then is we'll just extend the 2018 Farm Bill for 1 year while we're getting this legislation done. But I've always find it interesting to say, how did we get here? And if we think back to the very, very, very first Farm Bill, that was passed into law back in 1933. And I know most people born in 1933 aren't with us anymore, or they're 90 years old. But it had three original goals. And we have to think about the context of when this was passed. 1933 was just, we were in the Great Depression. And we also had the Dust Bowl happening out in the Western Plains. And so we passed this legislation with three goals in mind. One was to keep food prices fair for both the farmers and consumers, and to ensure an adequate food supply, which going through COVID, some people didn't have access to the food that they wanted. We went in the grocery stores. And so again, this didn't respond well to that, but that was the thought when we first did it. And then to protect and sustain the country's vital natural resources. And so those pieces are still part of the Farm Bill today. We've added stuff, as most legislation. I don't want to necessarily call it pork belly stuff or fat, but we have added other things to the Farm Bill over time. And so let's see what some of that is. And so right now we have 12 titles. In nutrition, again, we wanted to have adequate food supply. And so nutrition, which is our SNAP benefits, is part of this Farm Bill. And so that is to help people gain access to food. And being an economist, I always said there's two ways to increase prices for farmers, that is. One is to limit production or reduce supply, or the other one is to increase demand. And if we look at SNAP as one of those methods that we have for increasing demand by giving people with low incomes more money to spend on food, it does take more food out of the pipeline and keep the farm gate prices a little bit higher. And so, that is one of the mechanisms of the original Farm Bill that's still in place today. And then I'd put that one bolded in red because it is the biggest amount, and we'll come back to that. And then the next three programs that, again, compromise significant chunks. When I say significant, 9, 8, 7% of the total spending for the Farm Bill would be the commodity programs. And that's really and that's shifted over time. It used to be trying to control supply. Now it's trying to mitigate risk. And I'll come back to that one as well. Conservation, which with the Dust Bowl, we think about preserving our natural resources. It's also a big one in the Farm Bill. And then the one that wasn't there back in the day that's been added and now is a significant part of the Farm Bill is crop insurance. Crop insurance, when farmers buy crop insurance, it's not actuarially sound. Basically, it doesn't cash flow. When we buy car insurance or fire insurance, that's supposed to cash flow. The government subsidizes crop insurance to entice farmers to buy it. I think we're getting more comfortable with buying crop insurance as a risk management strategy that I would anticipate in the 2023 Farm Bill that might slack off just a little bit in terms of the monies flowing or the amount of subsidy that's coming into crop insurance.
Suppose that I'm a farmer and I have 50 acres that I want to start farming. Does the Farm Bill tell me what I can or cannot grow?
No, absolutely not. We had more constraints back in the 70s. We had the set aside program trying to reduce acreages, and it's really all tied back to a historical base on that farm, which what was grown on the farm historically, whether that's corn, whether that's wheat, whether that's cotton, whether that's peanuts, the Farm Bill payments still go back to that historical production, regardless of what's being grown on that farm today. And so many of our small tracts of land, your 50 acres you mentioned, may not even have a base. And without a base of some historical production, it would not even be eligible for the commodity programs. But now conservation and crop insurance, it would be. So there's some nuances in there, but overall, these are the programs. And so we have trade, credit, rural development, research extension related matters, forestry, energy, horticulture, and what doesn't fit in any of those they call a miscellaneous. And all of those titles together, those that are not bolded or bolded in red, they amount to less than 1% of the total expenditures of the Farm Bill. So, even though the Farm Bill is projected for the next one to be a little bit over $700 billion over a 5-year period, those take very little bit. And so even if it's 1%, it's still $7 billion that goes into those categories, but it's dwarfed by the other four main ones. So let's think about that distribution. This was the projected outlays for the Farm Bill that we're in. Since we don't have the new one written, we don't know how we're tweaking programs. I don't expect significant deviation from what the last one was in terms of where the money's going to be spent. But again, if you think about nutrition or those SNAP benefits, that's 76.1% of that $708 billion that was spent over a 5-year period. So that's where the lion's share, 3/4 of it, is going into that food assistance, helping to drive demand for food products here in the United States. And then crop insurance, again, that one has grown. I don't expect it to grow. 8.9%. Commodities, which is your commodity programs, ARC PLC, 7.3%. conservation 6.8, and I do expect conservation to grow a little bit. Here in Ohio, we have the H2O Ohio, which is locally funded through our state government to try to improve water quality in our streams and lakes. And I think that's going to continue, and especially if we think about what was on the news Monday of this week. And again, we're sitting here May 4th. Monday of this week, there was a huge wreck or pileup on the interstate out in Iowa because of a dust storm. And again, that's coming off of ground that's been worked and planted, and the winds come across and pick that up. So I think conservation will continue to get more attention. So let's just look at the nutrition title. I find it interesting. The Economic Research Service estimates that this title, again, 76.1 or 3/4 of the Farm Bill. But in 2021, the last year that they had data published for, 10% of households were food insecure. So, those of us that are gainfully employed at well-paying jobs, we never think about food insecurity. But, you look around, even parts here in Ohio, you get into some communities in Appalachia, and there is no fresh fruits, no fresh vegetables anywhere in a local store. I'm just thinking next door to me in Vinton County, they don't even have a grocery store. So you can go to Dollar General and get prepackaged, prepared stuff, which, yeah, it'll keep you alive, but it's not great nutrition. And so with 10% being food insecure, that's what these dollars are trying to help. And even though food insecurity has improved, if we go to the next slide here, better food security doesn't necessarily equate to lower spending in terms of dollars coming through the SNAP or the Nutritional Food and Nutrition Assistance Program. For fiscal year 21, it was $182 billion. That was 49% more than the previous high of $122 billion for the previous year. I think that is still effects of COVID. We think about when COVID started in 2021. I think we're still finding a lot of people that either were still unemployed, and so our even though our food security might have been better nationally, I think we had a lot of families that were insecure in terms of having finances available to buy food.
When you talk about benefits, we're looking at the old term food stamps. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's a huge part of it. I mean, there is a little bit in here for all of our SNAP education programs that we now have going on through Extension in every county of the state of Ohio, trying to help those that are SNAP eligible or food stamp eligible to spend their dollars more wisely, more nutritiously. And so we do have a great educational program that's also being funded through the Farm Bill, coming back to our extension offices, and we're working in every county trying to help people improve their lives. And so let's move away from that. I just wanted people to be aware that food stamps, as we used to call them, or SNAP benefits, is a part of the Farm Bill, and it is a huge part of the Farm Bill. But now let's get back to agriculture, and how does the Farm Bill support agriculture, which then in terms can support all of us as well, because now we're talking about a consistent, secure food supply. We're talking about minimizing risk to the farmers so that they're not in a position to exit out of farming. We can weather those storms such as COVID. COVID affected the farmer as well. I know we had animals that were ready to be harvested that couldn't move into the food chain because there was workers in the processing plants were ill with COVID, and so it was interesting time for agriculture as well. But if we think about crop insurance, again, one of those that has grown over the last couple farm bills, it's about 9% of the total outlays, and that includes support to crop insurance companies. Like I said earlier, it's not actuarially sound. And so, the money that we pay in as farmers and the money that's paid out to farmers for crop insurance claims, we would spend more than we take in. And that difference then is supplemented by the federal government through the Farm Bill. And the reason we did this, or the reason I think our legislators did this, is if we go back before crop insurance has only been around for 25 years or so. If we go previous to that, when we had a disaster, either a crop failure, flood, drought, whatever reason that we didn't have the quantity, and it's been mostly on crops, to sell, then we ended up with disaster payments. Well, disaster payments were never predictable. Where crop insurance, I know that if I put 9% of the $708 billion aside for crop insurance, that I'm not going to follow that up with a huge disaster payment. And so it becomes a known expense versus an unknown expense. And some of those years, the disaster payments were huge. And so this kind of mitigates the ups and downs of the expense for those crop failure years across the United States by using crop insurance as our tool to mitigate that risk.
Who does the insurance? Is it regular insurance companies or is there a special federal program?
No, it is private insurance companies that have gotten into the business of crop insurance. Typically, you don't find your insurance company that's selling auto and fire and selling crop insurance as well. This is another subset of insurance agents out here that deal specifically with crop insurance. So it's not mainstreamed for the general consumer. It is a specialized industry, but there are a number of providers in this industry that are
So
privately owned and operated.
it sounds like similar to flood insurance for homeowners.
Correct. Yes. It would be similar to that. Again, not everybody sells it. There is a separate industry for that as well. Moving on, conservation. We think about the expenditures for conservation, and again, 7% roughly. And I want to start thinking about what are those programs. And I didn't list them all, but I listed the four most common that might resonate with people. One is the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. We've heard that talked about in the media. And it's basically taking ground out of farm production and creating on it a habitat that is conducive for wildlife. And that's usually signed up for 20, 30-year blocks of time. Initially, they were targeting farm ground that had possibly shouldn't have been farmed, something that was highly erodible, something along the stream banks, trying to protect not only the ground from eroding, but then creating habitat for wildlife and protecting water quality. So it's a great program. Farmers that sign their ground, or landowners that sign their ground, they still have to maintain it. They still have to control invasive species. They still have to control noxious weeds. And so it's not just free money for doing nothing. They have to maintain that habitat then for whatever wildlife species are in their region or in their area. And so that is probably the biggest expense in conservation of all the programs, is the CRP. And then we go to the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, or ACEP. And again, that is working at trying to stabilize stream banks. And so that's specifically targeted for ground along major waterways, trying to get setback of 60, 120 feet, so that we have a large buffer for any natural drainage coming across to slow down and soak in, and we don't end up with our 3-inch rain all in the creek in 2 minutes. It slows it down. And so that's the other one. Environmental quality incentive programs. That one's really going after a lot of water quality. And so, whether that's putting tile plugs, a lot of our ground is tiled here in Ohio, to help with the drainage, but that also expedites the speed that the water gets to the stream. And so when we're not growing a crop from fall till spring, we may want to stop those tiles up just to slow that water down, have it retained in the ground, even though the ground may be more saturated. It's not hurting anything because we're not growing a crop. And so there's lots of practices we're doing trying to improve specifically water quality with the EQIP program. And the last one is conservation stewardship program. And that again is really it's an incentive program for things like cover crop or trying to have a living crop on the farm all months out of the year. And so it's an incentive to do things that maybe it doesn't cash flow today. I've had farmers that have played with cover crops and they say, at the end of the day, we're probably doing the right thing for the environment, but it's not profitable for my farm because of the expense of the cover crop seed, planting it, terminating it in the spring, and all the steps that go along with that. And so with the Conservation Reserve Program, we may be able to provide an incentive, if you will, to have them do that, which we know improves water quality, and then it cash flows for the farmer because of these incentive payments. And so that's really what conservation is about. It's about trying to provide opportunities that money comes with it to do the right thing for the environment and help it to cash flow so it's not a drain on that farm balance sheet.
It's my understanding with the cover crops that it really does help the soil revitalize it. Is that correct?
Oh, that is correct. Yeah, I mean, it really helps the microorganism community that's living in the soil revitalize, and we need those microorganisms then to help with breaking down of any kind of nutrients that can then become available to the plant. So, yeah, it's a good thing. And the commodity programs is the other big one. Again, that's been ARC or PLC. And again, at the last Farm Bill, we couldn't decide whether we wanted to do a price floor. So when the price fell below a certain price, you got a payment, or we wanted to do a revenue guarantee. And so they said, okay, farmers, we'll give you both choices. You figure out which one you want. And if you look over time, PLC seems to have paid more than the revenue, except for 16, 17, and 18. And if we project out, the price one looks like it's going to win. It's just a way to reduce risk. I like the revenue one theoretically better. Because if I'm protecting revenue, my dad always had a saying, you never go broke making money. And so we can protect a revenue that's a profitable level. Our farmers are going to be able to farm another year. But that's really just a price times yield type product that's available. And again, about 7%.
Help me to understand the commodity program. Let us suppose that I'm growing on my 50 acres corn.
It's a little bit like crop insurance, but not. First off, on your 50 acres, we go back to the base acres I talked about earlier, historically what's been grown on that farm. And so if you have a base, and let's say you have 50 acres of corn base, then the payment will be based on the historical yields on that farm, not the actual yields, times the base acres times a factor reduced by 86 by 14%. So it's a complicated formula. Unless you study it for a long time, we could spend another hour on the Zoom here before I can explain it thoroughly to you. But it's really based on those historical cropping patterns on that piece of ground. And so if we think about the Farm Bill, each new Farm Bill, it's modified to some extent. In the 70s, we really focused on land retirement and production reductions. We had the set-aside acres at the time. Recent Farm Bills, we've shifted to price support and then to risk management through the revenue guarantees we just talked about. But the Office of Budget and Management requires that the projected cost of the Farm Bill to remain the same for the next 10 years. And so, if we have our $708 billion, to add it to one area, we have to take it from another. We're not going to be adding new revenues. And so that's what that's what the argument in D.C. starts happening about is, I'm a senator in New York City. Well, I like SNAP benefits because it helps my people where, farm subsidies, commodity programs really doesn't help me. But yet, if I'm a senator in rural Iowa, I really don't have a lot of concern about SNAP benefits. I'm more concerned about keeping my farmers on the farm. And so that's where the argument starts happening in terms of how do we take this pot of money and divide it up among the different titles. And so potential focus, just looking forward, I mentioned this earlier. I think conservation programs, water quality and soil quality concerns. I mentioned the May 1st dust storm in Illinois. And so I think conservation programs could come out of this next farm bill a little bit of a winner, if you will. Commodity programs, crop insurance, I think we're going to continue the risk reduction programs to avoid those ad hoc disaster payments. Crop insurance could shrink a little bit simply because we're used to that as a risk mitigation process. And then I think livestock might see a greater opportunity here with COVID and some of the livestock things that were damaged, if you will. Livestock for the first time got to work with the local FSA office and get payments to help them weather the storm of low prices that occurred during COVID. So I think livestock might have a little bit of an uptick of opportunity in the next farm bill. And then if anybody has questions, they're always welcome to email me, bruynis.1@osu.edu. I'd be happy to have that conversation.
Hey, we're talking with Chris Bruynis. Chris is a extension educator with Ross County, but he works with a variety of different farmers and individuals throughout Ohio, and then some. Like Chris had said, he's always willing to answer any questions that you might have. Chris, great show. Thank you. I learned a lot.
All right. Glad to be here.